Most men don't wake up one day and decide to abandon the truth. It happens gradually, compromise by compromise, until one day they look up and don't recognize the world around them. One of the best examples I've seen of this is the TV show Breaking Bad. If you've never seen it, I don't necessarily recommend it, but if you watch the progression of what happens in that show, if you were to just watch the first episode of Walter White, mild-mannered chemistry teacher, and then if you just watched that episode and then you skipped all the way to the end, the very last episode where he's this, I don't want to give it away, but if you haven't watched it yet, by now you're probably not going to. But if you fast forward all the way and then watch the very last episode where he is literally like mass murdering people with a machine gun that he invented. And you watch the first episode and on the last episode, you're like, how in the heck did this guy go from here to here? But then if you watch all of the episodes in between, and there's like 100 episodes or something like that, and you watch each episode, it makes a logical progression. And he starts to make choices and he starts to make little compromises. And pretty soon he's doing this. And then because he did that, then he's got to do this. And then he's got to lie to his wife. And then he's got to lie to his son. And then he's got to treat this person this way. And then he's got to do this thing. And then he's got to rob. And then he's got to steal. And then he's got to kill somebody. Until by the end, you go from mild-mannered chemistry teacher to hardened drug dealer killing people. The reason I bring that up is because that's really what has happened in our culture and society over the last 80 to 100 years. It's coming to fruition right now in what's happening in the world over the last couple of weeks, couple of months from like last year or so. So if you've watched, how did we as a culture and a society get to where we are? To where all of these things that used to be unacceptable are now acceptable. And not just acceptable, they're considered to be normal, and not just normal, but like just part of everyday life. There has been a long, slow, steady progression from things that we once thought and were considered to be normal and a part of our lives to us having to accept all of these things that are counterintuitive to who we are. And that's what this episode is going to be about. Like, we've been slowly degrading the idea of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what marriage looks like, what family looks like, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a good human, a good person, what it means to be a good Christian. All of these things, I don't think I have to get into a whole lot of details. We all kind of understand it. We all see it. And over the course of decades now, we've been trained and taught to think that if we don't accept these things, that there's something wrong with us. That if we're aggressive, if we're strong, if we're masculine, that somehow that's a bad thing. And we need to accept all these feminine characteristics. And then we can't even, if you watch, like slowly it progresses to where there's not as much difference between what men and women are supposed to be. It's intentional. We've even degraded that as far as like what our borders are. We are the United States of America, those of us here. Whatever country you're in, wherever you live, that is your country. You have a people. You have an identity that is separate and distinct from other people. It's not all supposed to be this one homogeneous blob, this global blob of humanity. As individuals, as countries, we are supposed to have certain identities. And that has been degrading for the last 80 to 100 years, if not longer. So why has the shift back to some of those old school traditional values seemed to be so sudden? It seems to have happened like that. Last year, I dropped an episode and I called it a return to orthodoxy. When I was preaching at my church, I was talking about this idea of orthodoxy and what that looks like. Like there's this whole movement, there's been this whole movement towards young people shifting more and more conservative. Young people taking voluntary vows of celibacy, giving up drinking, guys going to the gym not just to look good, but to be strong, men learning how to defend themselves by taking jujitsu and other martial arts, men striving for and wanting to be excellent, but then constantly being told by society and by culture and by all these people that no, that's a bad thing. They've been constantly beat down. No, anything and everything that makes you a man is wrong with you. Anything and everything that makes you a woman separate from a man, like, that's something wrong. We need to mix all these things, but that's not the truth. Like, and we know that deep down inside of us. We know that there are things that make us separate. There are things that make us distinct. There are things that make us men and women. There are things that make us families. There are things that make us Americans or Filipino or Russian or Chinese or whatever it is. There are separate and distinctions, and they're supposed to be there, and that's natural. That there's a natural order of things, and that's the way that it's supposed to be. It took a long time. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of effort to go from what we believe, what we know the natural order of things is, to this unnatural order of things. But then what we're seeing now is the snapback, right? Because the move towards things that are unnatural takes a long time. But when you shift back to the natural order of things, it happens very quickly. And I think we've all seen that. Over the course of the last month or so, I've been reading this book. It's called Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. And I've been reading it, and it took me about 100 pages or so through it to really I was kind of like, this seems kind of weird. I'm not getting this. And then all of a sudden, all the pieces came together when he started talking about this very concept, this very idea. So I just want to read a little bit from this book because it made a whole lot of sense to me when I read it. So this is G.K. Chesterton. Man will sometimes act slowly upon new ideas, but he will only act swiftly upon old ideas. And that's the whole thing, right? You don't see these revolutions. Revolutions don't generally pop up overnight. They're usually the result of years and or decades of things that are going on under the surface to push a certain agenda along. And then there's a revolution that seems to happen overnight. But then you get the people that when they want to go back to the original way that they do things, that doesn't take a long, slow progression. It takes one person, it takes one action, it takes one thing to shift it back to the way that it's supposed to be. Going on a little bit more. If I'm merely to float or fade or evolve, it may be towards something anarchic, crazy, chaos. But if I am to riot, it must be for something respectable, orthodoxy, tradition. This is the whole weakness of certain schools of progress and moral evolution. They suggest that there has been a slow movement towards morality with an imperceptible ethical change in every year or every instant. There's only one great disadvantage in this theory. It talks of a slow movement towards justice, but it does not permit a swift movement. This idea, like social justice, that's what I'm talking about. This whole idea of these DEI things and stuff like that. Like, it takes a long time to push that through. But the swift movement, like, you can't do that kind of stuff overnight. The swift movement is when you're going back to the traditions. So this whole idea of what seems to be going on in the world right now, this snapback, we're watching it in our culture. President Trump was inaugurated, as of the dropping of this episode, just about 2 weeks ago. And we've seen so many drastic changes in our country and even in the world and how the world is responding to what's going on here in America. Like, there's been this cultural shift that seems to have happened overnight when we start to eliminate, we got to make employment merit-based. The positions you get is not based on your skin color or your gender or your identity or anything like that. The positions that you get, the jobs that you get should be based on merit alone. America should have strong borders. We don't need these certain types of people in the military. The truth should be told. The media should be honest. All of these things that seem like these crazy things, these are just actually the return to normalcy. This is how things are supposed to be, which is why it seems like it's happening like that. Because this long, slow progression, and then the snapback that's happening now, people are like, oh, this makes sense. This jives with who I am and who I feel like I'm supposed to be. I no longer have to fight against all of those ideas. I now just get to be a man. I now just get to be a woman. I now just get to appreciate family. I now get to appreciate what it's like to be an American or whatever nationality you are. And it's happening not just here in America, but it's spreading across the world as we see people in competent leadership, people who are restoring simple, basic common sense. Like the fight against common sense takes a lot more work than the fight against common sense. So when common sense rears its ugly head, people go, I resonate with that. That's what I want. That's what I need. And they snap right back to it. The Bible talks about this. There's a story in the Bible, and one of the kings, in 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, it talks about King Josiah. So King Josiah is in a whole line of kings, and there's been a whole bunch of bad kings in Israel and Judea, and they've all led up to this point. They've started to worship idols. They've started to lead their country into sin. They've started to lead their country away from the traditions. They've forgotten what the temple was for. They've forgotten all the laws. They've forgotten the Passover, and they've forgotten all these things that made them Jewish Israelites. So Josiah comes to the throne, and he's 8 years old. Not much he can do at 8 years old, but he comes to the throne at 8 years old because that's the way things have worked back then. And he starts to make some changes as best as he can at that age, right? Then in the 18th year of his reign, so he's 26 years old, he tells some of his officials, hey, we need some money for some things. Go over to the temple and do an audit. Start to look through the treasure, start to look through the gold, start to look through all this stuff to try to figure out like where the money is and if we can help these other people, right? So his officials go over to the temple, and in the process of cleaning out the temple, looking for all this stuff, they find these old scrolls. Well, these old scrolls are the book of the law, the book of Deuteronomy. This is how far Israel has fallen, is that they have lost the original copies of the law. They don't even know where they are. And it takes this guy who happens to be going off for an audit, and they happen to find these books, and they bring them back to Josiah, and he reads them, and he rips his clothes, and he begins to weep and wail before the Lord for how far his country has fallen, for how far they are away from God. And it distresses him to the point that he starts to implement all these changes throughout Israel. And Israel, the entire country, is like, holy crap, how did we miss this? We've got to get back to this. And they start to implement the ceremonial laws again, and the sacrifices, and the temple worship, and all of the things that made them Israel in the first place. It was the snapback because they recognized it. They knew it. It felt natural. It felt normal to them. So King Josiah, in one instant, after decades of a long, slow progression to something that wasn't normal, that wasn't natural, in one moment, in a very brief period of time, he reforms the entire country because they knew that's what they were supposed to be doing the whole time, and they had gotten away from it, and now it was easy for them to go back. Well, it wasn't easy for them, but they saw it, and they knew that's what they needed to do. And Josiah is listed as one of the very few actually righteous kings in the history of Israel. Josiah is recorded as one of the greatest kings. Unfortunately, he died when he was only 39 years old, so he came to power at age 8. He implemented all these reforms at age 26, and then he died when he was 39 years old in battle. But he's still listed as one of the greatest kings in the history of Israel. In my own personal life, I've seen this happen too. I've shared the story about the trip I made to Colorado, and this was after I had started to just really go off the deep end as far as drugs and alcohol, and I just was not living the way that I was raised. I was not living how I grew up. I was living contrary to what I knew, but that progression from what I knew to the life that I was then living and the way that I was thinking, understanding God with all these liberal ideas, and that it was okay to do this, and it was okay to do that, and it was okay to do this. Like, it took a long time to get there. But when I stood there in that field, and I've told this story at least once or twice, about the guy, how I was sitting in the back of the truck, pissing and moaning about God, and the guy gets out of the truck, he says, Andrew, I need to pray for you. And I said, okay. And he prayed for me, and he said, Andrew, you still believe in God. That was my snap back to reality. And in that instant, when he said that, all that despair, all of that doubt, all of those crazy notions that I was thinking about of who God was and who God isn't and what life was all about, and all of this stuff just instantly faded away. And I knew in that moment, because he was speaking truth to me, that truth was more powerful in that instant to change all of that long, slow progression. That was my story. So we have the Bible, we have history, we have my own personal story. Like, of this long, slow progression to these negative thoughts, these bad ideas, and then the snapback. We've seen it in our culture now. We've seen it historically, and I have seen it in my whole life, in my own personal life. So my question and my challenge to you is, where do you see in your own life that long, slow progression to becoming something that you're not? To becoming something that you never were? To believing things that you never thought you would? Maybe it's in your personal health. Maybe it's in your business. Maybe it's in your relationship. Maybe it has to do with God. Maybe it has to do with politics. Maybe it has to do with society. I don't know what it has to do with. But I guarantee you that if you look just a little bit, you see some areas where you've really started to drift. And over time, you've allowed these little thoughts, you've allowed these little things to drift you way off track. And you can't even believe that you think those things. Or maybe you don't even recognize that this is far off from where your base is. But now, all this time later, it feels natural to you. I am asking you to look a little deeper and think about, how does that actually fit with who you were, who you are, and how you were raised and what you believed? The point I'm trying to make is that every single one of us can find and see areas in our life. If we just look a little bit, we can see where we've drifted off track. If our country can do it, if our world can do it, then we can do it too. We can snap back. We can get back to those things that made us great, that made us who we are. So I hope you appreciate this. Today's episode is actually part 1 of what's going to be at least 2 parts. Next week, in part 2, we're going to talk about how we can actively combat this long, slow drift that we see in ourselves and that we see in our society and that we see in our culture. So if you got anything out of this, I'd appreciate you giving the video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, drop a comment, check out the description, go to my social media, check me out there more, send me a direct message, and we'll talk to you next time.
So if you like this content, please give it a rating, a review, and share it with your friends. Also, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about me and what I'm all about and what I can maybe do for you, check out my website at thedangerousgentleman.org. That's thedangerousgentleman.org. Thank you for listening.